If you love Push Black's Black History Year, you'll love our newest podcast called 2 Minute Black History. In only 2 minutes, you'll hear little-known stories about our people and reclaim the knowledge we need to take action and advance our community. To move towards the future, you've got to look to the past. Learn the history you didn't get in school. Tune in to 2 Minute Black History every Tuesday through Friday, right on the Black History Year feed and wherever you listen to podcasts.
Let's begin with the story. In the beginning, there was only none, the primal ocean of chaos. Dormant in those waters lay a god, a mere seed, waiting for his moment to emerge. Through his will alone, he pushed through the chaos and named himself Ra. And by way of his birth, according to this Egyptian myth, the universe was born. From Ra came other gods, and from Ra's tears came mankind. But after the passage of many ages, man turned on their creator, schemed to overthrow their god king. This incited the wrath of Ra. With the council of gods, he concluded that mankind must pay for its sin. He concluded that punishment could only come through an apocalypse. I'm Jay from Push Black, and you're listening to Black History Year. Whether etched in hieroglyphics on Egyptian tombs or orated from the Yoruba people through generations, ancient legends of gods live on, fueling the human imagination. Many thinkers, like Adrienne Marie Brown, have said that imagination creates our reality, which raises the question, is mythology more than fiction? Like Ra, have myths pushed beyond the waters of fantasy to give rise to reality and even activate its end? Today's guest says yes, it has that power and much, much more. By fusing art and activism, she's created strategies to survive the end of times. Li Sumpter is a mythologist, eco-activist, and multidisciplinary artist who is confronting earthly challenges like racial injustice, food shortages, war, and other atrocities through what she calls the art of survival. Using D.I.Y. media, afrofuturism, and gameplay to cultivate eco-awareness and community action, she's exploring real and imagined existential threats to mind, body, and spirit, while also offering creative solutions in the here and now. Stay tuned for an interview that'll make you question reality as you know it and provide the tools we need to survive an apocalypse. First up, another myth from ancient Egypt about a cobra goddess whose power of protection lived on even in death. Check this out.
He desperately needed her protection. She was the most powerful deity and the only one he could trust with his life. How he paid homage to her is legendary, and one of the reasons we still provide offerings to our ancestors today. Wadjet, the cobra goddess of ancient Egypt, was strikingly beautiful and powerful. The pharaoh depended on Wadjet's powers for protection, so he paid homage to her by including her in the design of his royal diadem. The crown was designed to look like a cobra about to strike, acknowledging Wadjet's deadly might. But the symbol did more than protect the pharaoh's life. It protected him after death. Statues and paintings of the rearing cobra were used to decorate the inside of the pharaoh's tomb to protect it from grave robbers. The symbol also appeared in the Book of the Dead, implying that Wadjet held some role in assisting the pharaoh's spirit through Duat, the underworld. Across the world, it's still a common practice to decorate our ancestors' graves with symbols and objects meant to guide them in the spirit realm. Practice consistently honoring our ancestors, be it with altar offerings or visiting their graves. These offerings work to protect our ancestors and provide them with ease.
Lee, what does Black liberation look like to you?
I think for me, I work in the arts and I work in the field of mythology. And for me and the work that I do, I feel that it's always centered on the power of the imagination, right? The power of art and mythology to create change in the world. And I feel like these are things that really begin on that front line of any fight, right? Any struggle really begins in the mind first. And so I believe that what Black liberation looks like for me is a liberated mind, a mind that is free to dream and to create and to imagine endless possibilities, regardless of, you know, the state of the world we live in that often holds us back and pushes us down and oppresses us in so many ways, body, mind, and spirit. Black liberation is the freedom to dream.
That resonates with me in many ways. That piece about the freedom to dream and create and imagine is key within that as well, right? That understanding that you mentioned, that there are forces that have prevented us from doing so. And in order to actually practice self-determination, we have to be the ones to imagine what that looks like. So I appreciate that. And I'm curious now, how does your work towards a vision of Black liberation?
I think for me as a mythologist, it's about creating new myths, creating new stories that we as a people can believe in, that put us in the future that we're dreaming of. And storytelling can be done in so many different ways. And I feel like I am enjoying the contemporary arts and media that are available to us as creators today in terms of, the ways that stories can manifest, the different platforms that we can use to tell our stories. I'm writing a project that is what they call transmedia, right? It's a transmedia narrative because it's being told across multiple platforms and forms of media. So for me, the story Graffiti in the Grass is a story that I'm writing. It's an Afrofuturist myth, um, one of apocalypse, of apocalyptic change. And it's set in my hometown of Philadelphia. And it's very much about the future and not in the apocalyptic sense that we are so accustomed to experiencing or being told about, being presented through the media, everything from Hollywood to the commercials we watch, to the headlines that we read. But thinking about apocalypse as birth, death, and rebirth, and really focusing on the possibilities, on the hope, on that rebirth, that phase of transformation that is always inevitable. It's always going to come, but it's really about having the hope and the stamina to hold on till those moments, and also to make them happen for ourselves. So for me, I'm trying to write transformative stories, um, transformative myths that really immerse readers or participants, trying to engage people in narratives through actual physical problem solving and creative challenges. And these are all the things that I feel help us to kind of embody a story, and kind of make it our own and actually become a part of that story, live it, like actually not just read it or watch it on a screen, but actually live the myth that you're trying to create.
That's incredible. And if I'm understanding correctly, one of the stories, I think the sorry, the graffiti one. What's the title of that one?
graffiti in the grass. It's
Graffiti in the
actually,
grass.
yeah, it's a metaphor for crop circles. I'm very much into crop circles and graffiti culture. You know, I grew up in the 80s.
Mm,
If I had a chance to do it all over again, I would probably, really try to get more into graffiti than, what I've actually had the experience of in this lifetime. It takes a certain kind of artist to be able to really immerse themselves in that culture because, as you know, for so long, graffiti was illegal,
yeah.
to do these kinds of things. But there is something about making your mark in the world. It's not like I'm promoting vandalism or anything, but I do like, I'm very much, have always been a fan and enamored with Egyptian culture and hieroglyphics and any kind of code or glyph or symbolism or lexicon of any kind. I'm really a lover of symbols, and so graffiti culture really speaks to me. For those who are unfamiliar, crop circles are these amazing designs that show up in fields, typically, I think, wheat or barley fields, but and they can be in other places as well, but they show up in a miraculous fashion, in a mysterious fashion. People don't know how they're made, or who's making them. That's what really inspires me, and kind of gets my mind going in terms of what is just awesome and like wonderful, like something that really inspires wonder in this world for me right now.
And I can absolutely understand that. I remember years ago when I first learned about crop circles. That sort of is one of the avenues to just opening up questions and pathways to saying, okay, there's a lot of mysteries of this world and of this universe that we can't comprehend, but there's something there that perhaps we could go on a journey to figure out. And so I think it's interesting that you bring that in as part of your work, especially around mythology, as it relates to myth. Give us some relevant context for Black folks and mythology. What is that connection that we have to mythology?
Wow, I mean, it really all depends on the individual, to be honest. I think that, we can be Black folks walking on this earth right now in this day and time and really be disconnected from that mythology, from the truth, really, that is a part of our history, as folks who have been achieving Black excellence for millennia. And I think that a big part of, what new myth makers today are challenged with is like trying to find a mythology that is going to embrace our culture and embrace it in a way where we are inspired and invited to become a part of it, right? So, for example, you think about the mythologies of the Egyptians, and Egyptian mythology was not a storybook situation, right? It was a lived mythology. They wholeheartedly believed in the gods and goddesses of their pantheon. They walked among them. They were incorporated into their daily lives and rituals. They dictated their actions on the living plane, the earthly dimension, because they truly believed that they were working towards immortality. That was something they wholeheartedly believed. And it's very similar for the Yoruba culture, and the idea of anyone that is, connected to the African traditions and religion of Yoruba. It's something that is like, if you think about the city, the sacred city of Ile-Ife, and how the individuals of that city are living a sacred life on a daily basis. Every minute, every day of their lives is being lived within a certain practice and belief system. And they're just so intimately connected to that reality. It's not a mythology that is based in story or something that's fictional, but it's actually a mythology that's based in truth. And it actually gives rise to their very reality, the thing that they experience on a day to day basis. And I think that that's one of the things that, for me as a mythologist, I'm kind of liberated from. the restriction to kind of practice one dogma or believe in one faith, because mythology is at the root of all religions, and I believe that we really, you know, it's hard because when you think about the state of the world and all the violence and things that are happening, um, just there's a lot of darkness right now, I think, in the world, and it concerns me. And I think it concerns so many of us, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons why I decided to study apocalyptic mythologies, because I really was so concerned about the future. So, even I myself, I'm trying to, Julian, I'm trying to get more connected to the wisdom, to the metaphysical reality that any myth could actually be my reality.
So, Lee, when you say wisdom and metaphysical reality, I want to dig deeper there, and sort of reconcile some of what I think many people think when they hear about mythology. I think a lot of folks don't hear wisdom. A lot of folks hear maybe misunderstanding or naivete when it's like, okay, these people, whoever the people are that created the myths, perhaps were trying to um, explain some kind of phenomenon that they didn't have language for, didn't have a scientific understanding of, with sort of the assumption that science that we know today, should have an answer for everything that we come across. So I'm curious to what your thoughts on that type of perspective is and how that connects with your understanding of myth.
That's one of the greatest misunderstandings of all, that folks that created some of these early myths, about um, the changing of the seasons, or the sunrise and sunset, the moon and the stars, all those things, right? These are also some of the same peoples that were able to predict eclipses and certain astrological events without the modern technologies and sciences that we function on today. And scientists are baffled today when they think about, like, how did these people build these monuments, right? These structures that were aligned with certain constellations. Like, they didn't have this and they didn't have that. Like, but they're actually more on the money than some scientists today, who are just now figuring out and cracking the code of what the ancients already knew so long ago, or even some of these quote unquote more primitive tribes or cultures that anthropologists have identified.
I think about like the Dogon when you mentioned that in Mali, and the sort of myth and cosmology around Sirius. Don't want to get too deep into that now, but that's just what came to mind. There's many of those examples where it's like, okay, there's no way they could have done this then, if we couldn't do it now. So what is that all about?
One of my favorite definitions of mythology that I often use and quote, I'm going to try to paraphrase it, but Maya Deren, an anthropologist and a dancer and artist in her own right, she wrote a book called The Divine Horseman, and she studied the Yoruba religion in Haiti, and she um, coined this definition of myth. She said, myth is the facts of the mind manifest through a fiction of matter.
Hmm. Say that one more time for us, please.
Myth is the facts of the mind made manifest through a fiction of matter.
Mm.
It's not a long definition, but there's so much in there to unpack, because there is a lot of like metaphysical references or inferences there. And then also, too, this fiction of matter. So it's just like, okay, so how does the material world actually come to be, and so that's where this idea of mythology, this system and framework of belief of a culture, depending on where you come from or what part of the world you live in and what you believe, that's going to give rise to your actual reality, to your physical reality, and it has to be one that is collectively believed. You know what I mean? That's how a culture kind of operates within a collective mythos. But we also kind of all have our own personal mythology, right? So, like, I mean, on another level, you can think about if someone thinks that they are the second coming. You know what I mean? There's some people walking around thinking that's the case. they might actually move through life as if that is true. And God help them, because they're gonna get a rude awakening on, like, trying to do certain things, or get away with certain things. When you think about Black and brown folks and young kids, right? If they don't believe in themselves, if they think that they're nothing, if they think that they're not smart, if they think that they don't have a hope at surviving, even the realities of their own neighborhood, if they wholeheartedly believe that mythology, right, that apocalyptic mythology that is very real for Black and brown neighborhoods today, then it's kind of like a manifest destiny. When I realized that's actually how mythology works, that's when I like everything was just, bells were ringing in my head, where I was just like, this is what I am going to pursue. Because again, you take a degree, everybody kind of finds their own lane, that kind of X that marks the spot that they're going to dig deeper into. And for me, it's the metaphysical elements. And that's kind of where this idea of storytelling and immersive storytelling that can be transformative, where, what we read and what we think and believe actually manifests and becomes our physical reality.
And one example that comes to mind for me that I speak with my team about as we're working on our narrative strategies is like there is this origin story, this myth that um, whiteness has, and that I think empowers white supremacy and uh, coloniality in the sense that we're sort of all taught over here that civilization began with the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans, and that they were the ones who created all of these practices of science, this math, this understanding of the world. So, if you have the foundation of civilization starting with folks that look white, then that leads everyone else that is white, regardless of where their direct ancestry came from, to be able I can bend the world in a certain way because I'm of that same stock. I am that foundational piece of civilization. I have a duty, like this idea of the white man's burden, to have this duty to go out and save the savages or to overcome nature because I have created this thing, right? And we're taught that Black folks did not contribute to that, but the opposite seems to be the case from my understanding and the research of others before us in terms of where a lot of that knowledge actually came from in Black societies, Black cultures, indigenous cultures, that was in taken, spun, and built upon by others. And so that, to your point, sort of taking a macro look at that community example you gave, it's like if we are not taught that we are able to create civilizations that we came sort of afterwards and others had to civilize us, then I think that sort of limits what we're able to both do now and imagine in the future. So I'm of the belief that we have a certain origin story, which for us in America, I think is, hey, our origins are in slavery. For many of us, that's where it starts. But I believe even going to history, getting in touch with a new origin story, a new mythology of how things came to be, in addition to those that have existed across time, is a powerful way, or could be a powerful way of really transforming our now and the future.
Yeah, it's funny. As you were talking, I have to admit that one of the images that popped into my head was the image of Michael Jackson as the Scarecrow on the pole in The Wiz. I don't know if you've seen the film. Have you seen the
I've
film? You
seen the
have to.
image. I've not seen the film. Don't tell anybody though.
I'm not going to take anybody's black card today. We won't do that. Not on
uh,
your podcast. I won't do
yeah,
that.
not
But
today.
I
Maybe
will
next
say,
time.
next time, but I will say that it's a very important um, image, I think, that relates to what you've said, because the thing about what he was doing, he played the scarecrow, right? And he was up on this pole, and the crows were badgering him and oppressing him, right? They would not let him get down off of this here pole, right? They would not let him get down off the pole, and he was stuck. And it wasn't until Dorothy came around, right, and let him know that all he had to do was ask for a helping hand and get on down. It was like the thing that was standing in between him being a free liberated person was his own mindset. He was believing what the crows told him, right? When we believe another person's narrative of ourselves, right? If we believe another culture's history of our people, then we're going to be in a prison of our own minds, you know? And it's really that simple on one hand, but then it's just that hard because I can speak to this firsthand that one of the hardest things to undo is the damage of a miseducation that was received at a young age. You know what I mean? And to unlearn, and then reimagine and teach oneself that there's another way, that there's another possibility. It's almost like a house of cards just collapses because your reality and your belief of yourself and the world that you're in and your place in it was based on a false narrative of who you are and where you came from. And so, that's why we need these new myths. We need new myth makers and storytellers to not only reimagine the future and putting ourselves in our brightest tomorrows and those possibilities of what that could be, but it's also about reaching back to our past and bringing it forward to help us remember what we've forgotten, right? And a lot of that is this idea of Sankofa, which is often used in Afrofuturism and in Black liberation movements in general. This idea of going back to get it right, going back to the past to retrieve that wisdom, that knowledge, that love of ourselves and our community, and bringing it back to the present so that we can build a better future, based on the truth that is actually aligned with our highest possibilities.
I'm curious, for you and your work, was there a certain perhaps event or bit of information? What led you to a realization around the need for what we're talking about today?
Well, for me, it's a couple things. One was, as a youth, I was exposed to an apocalyptic film. It was more like Monday night movie type of thing. It was called The Day After. I don't know if you recall the film, but it was basically about nuclear holocaust. What if, the Russians dropped a bomb on us kind of thing. Um, and they showed the devastation of nuclear fallout, the blast and everything. And I was young when I wasn't really supposed to be watching it. And I didn't even watch the film from start to finish, but the scenes that I saw changed my life forever, because those scenes became seeds in my mind, right? Like, um, of darkness and destruction and thinking about gosh, is this going to happen to us, and so at a very young age I became very concerned, downright horrified, fearful of this apocalyptic future. And that then stayed with me. It was always kind of a dark undercurrent in my spirit. I was a happy person, I would say, looking back on my childhood and my teens and all that stuff. I didn't learn until later, right? Because like therapy, my degree is also in psychology. I'm not a stranger to therapy. I definitely am a fan of it, you know what I mean, especially in these days and times. But I feel like I learned through my own study of psychology and my own therapy that I've been receiving since teenager, that I catastrophize. It's actually a thing that people can do. Some people have OCD, some people have different things, that they're dealing with, right? And their mental health. And for me, it was doing this thing called catastrophizing. And I would think about, like these huge catastrophes that could happen because I was already so fixated, in my unconscious mind about this possibility. And I think that when I got older and I learned about mythology, my father introduced me to Joseph Campbell through PBS. I mean, I'd already loved Star Wars, but I didn't realize that it was Joseph Campbell that actually informed the kind of mythological framework that George Lucas based Star Wars on, you know? And so when I start to put all these things together, I realized that, you know, I could learn from these stories, because not all these stories were about the end of the world. Some of them were about surviving the end of the world, right? But when you think about a series that goes on for season after season, and these people are in an apocalypse that is lasting for years, you learn how to survive for the short term and the long term. You know what I mean? And I was just so fascinated by that, because that was my way of figuring out how to learn that if this was a reality that I, in fact, believed I was going to face, how could I still go about my daily life, but also try in the meantime to quietly get prepared? And I say quietly because you probably already know that those who really take to preparing for disasters and the end of the world, so to speak, are not really viewed by society as sane or reasonable people. You know what I mean? Um, they get a bad rap, you know what I mean? And I've watched some of those shows like the Doomsday Preppers on, like, I think it was Nat Geo, National Geographic, or the History Channel or something like that. And you know, they always get the folks that are on one side of the spectrum, but there's also everyday people that are concerned about these things, you know what I mean? And that's when like books like Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower really help to normalize this idea that you don't have to be like a doomsday prepper that, you know, has this bunker and doesn't see the light of day, and like, you know, is just really kind of antisocial and distrusting of individuals. But what about folks who are actually just everyday people that are trying to survive? That's why I love like stories like Terminator, even though they get really sensational on one end. Think about how this is a single mom, Sarah Connor, who she was just a waitress minding her own business. You know what I mean? And then all of a sudden, a machine comes from the future, lets her know that her son is going to be, you know, the savior of humanity, and like, you know, she's got to get on this mission all of a sudden. And then when we see her, by the time we get to one of those last installments, I mean, she's just this badass that nobody wants to mess with. You know what I mean? I love stories like that, that take everyday people who are reluctant survivors and it turns them into badass warriors, you know?
In many ways, I think that the nature of Black existence in America actually requires a certain extent of that doomsday prepper energy, just on a day to day, as you were mentioning, not um, in the sense that the entire world's going to end, but many of us are just like one step away, one accident away from, okay, now I can't pay my water bill. You know, might need to store up some water. One step away from, okay, my life has just changed because I got this ticket, can't pay it. Now we're one step away from a lot of disastrous events happening. That's something I think about often. People were looking at me wild at the beginning of the pandemic when I started stocking up on on a bunch of things that I'm not going to get into right now. But before people knew what it was, but it's one of those things that I had that mentality myself prior to that, so I was already sort of far along. But I say that to say that even outside of a pandemic like disaster situation, many of us are living in those situations where that type of attention is needed. So I'm curious, you know. Um, are we living right now in a apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic scenario in some ways? What says yes, what says no about the ways and the conditions we live in as a people overall?
We're definitely living in an apocalyptic world, and have been for some time now. And like to quote Sun Ra, he says that, you know, the world's already ended. Don't you know that? Like, you know, it's already after the end of the world. And I think that that's also like understanding that we're kind of living through the death of a certain sense of humanity, the way people don't treat each other with equity and compassion and empathy and all these things, you know. And he was specifically talking about Black and brown folks, you know, that like, hey, Earth is no place for the Black man, Black people, and we need to think about exodus, you know, off world, like, you know, really considering taking our things and packing it up and hitting the road for another planet. You know, the pandemic showed us that we're literally a paycheck away from, you know, just starving, poverty. So many of us are just trying to get by. But it's not just about the economy; it's so much else because it really exasperated so many other conditions that were already like at the tipping point. You know, in terms of this violence, this violent culture that we live in, and you know, how do we survive that? And I think that the pandemic was what they call an NDE, you know, a near death experience that we all experience as a culture. And some of us didn't make it out. It's interesting because the pandemic affected folks in different ways. Some people who still haven't, you know, COVID hasn't caught up with them yet, like they don't even know. But like I can speak for, look, when I got COVID, I was really concerned. You know what I mean? I even had the shots and everything, but I was still just like, am I gonna make it? You know, it's kind of it's a scary feeling. But then on top of that, you know, I think it makes us really reach for that thing outside of ourselves, right? Like when we're in an existential dilemma, when we're in a crisis, we always reach for something higher than ourselves. So I think the pandemic helped a lot of people reconfigure their priorities in terms of like, you know, I know it helped me. I love the city of Philadelphia, but I was in a very, very violent carjacking maybe a year ago that changed my life, you know, and this idea of like PTSD was like these four letters that I knew what they meant, but to actually experience it, I really say prayers for everyone who has experienced PTSD and is living with it. And I'm not just talking about veterans, you know, and folks that have been through war, but people that have been through any kind of violence. Um, you're always constantly looking over your shoulder, you know, your nerves are always kind of on edge, and it makes it very hard to go about your daily life. It really truly does. And it also makes you be, you know, I have this gratitude just for the simplest things, you know what I mean, for my connections with my family, you know, just to know that I could have not made it out of that situation. It could have been lights out for me and that was it. But I made it out, and now I feel like my purpose in this work around this art of survival um, is even more, um, it has more meaning to me now than it did before,
Mm,
for sure.
wow. I could definitely see that. I'm sorry that that happened to you. That's I can only imagine, you know, how that
Yeah,
weighs on you on an ongoing basis and how that
yeah.
influences your work with survival. And to that point, in terms of the survival piece on day to day and future, one of your pieces of work, from my understanding, is interactive experience or piece. There's some element to it that involves actual maps, but it takes place in the future, and it's like these are escape routes to get out of Philly or something like that. Am I accurate in my understanding? What am
Yeah,
I
no,
talking
okay,
about
I
here? Yeah.
appreciate No, I appreciate you. Well, you're actually talking about graffiti in the grass, right?
Okay.
Because it's the same story, right? So, in that same way, I was talking about how graffiti in the grass is transmedia, you know, where the narrative is being told across multiple platforms. So, this idea of an escape room, right? I don't know if you've ever experienced an escape room or been through one yourself, but I've been through a couple, and I've been inspired by the format, right, of like this live gaming challenge to escape a situation, right? There's so many great films that are about escapes, you know, Escape from New York, you know. There's like this idea of like what, you know, how, because for me, it's always like, how can I gamify this idea of the art of survival, right? How can I actually get people interested in it? Because you got to understand, Julian, like, and I guess you do because you're a bit of a prepper yourself, but like my friends, you know, they were not drinking the Kool-Aid, you know, and even if they were aware that I was actually speaking some truth, a lot of people find it much easier to deny that truth so they can just enjoy their day. Nobody wants to think about survival and preparing for the worst, right? But the thing is, so many of us watch these films. We watch The Walking Dead. We watch, some of these, even movies, series like Snowfall that deal with like, surviving in the inner city and dealing with that lifestyle. It can be any lifestyle, but the idea is, for example, so many situations with climate change and ecology, global warming. We're dealing with floods and earthquakes and you name it. But I did this event called Art of Survival Agents of Escape with a group called Theater in the X, a Black-led theater company that I work with here in Philly. And one of the things we did was dramatize these scenarios that helped us figure out like what to do to escape a flood, because this was real things that were happening. These were in the headlines, right? Like, how do you do that? What do you do when your car is being submerged and you're stuck inside it? What do you do when there's an active shooter? There's, just like we know about stop, drop, and roll when we deal with a fire in our homes. We used to be kind of schooled on that. The firemen would come to the school and we'd have the assembly and we would learn about this or whatever. But now it's like we have different threats, so now it's run, hide, fight. That's about, we got to learn these things because of active shooters and the epidemic of gun violence that is just devastating this country. And so, yeah, I mean, we got to think. So for me, it's like, yes, the map, I think about like, okay, escape from New York. What would be the escape from Philly? You know what I mean? How will we get out of here if it was, say, a pandemic or a viral situation, or maybe it was like civil unrest and everybody was going postal and losing their minds, you know what I mean? And trying to break down doors and rob your family, like thinking about, how we would deal with it. So there's a lot of practical things we could do, like just know your emergency exits when you walk in a room. Like just note those exits when you walk in the room. Or even like when you go on a Bumble date or something, and like nowadays it's like you got to give the information to your friends or you could end up off the map, you know what I mean? And never heard from again. So there's just little things we can do and then there's big things we could do, but as long as we're doing something.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate the way that you are using art to um, transmit those messages and engage folks. It's amazing to me because my understanding of art and culture and the way that our people have engaged for centuries is not, it's rarely just art for art's sake, right? It's a matter of
Exactly.
passing down culture and practices and values, survival tools, spiritual tools, and connection. So it's really great to see and hear how you're doing that with your art and using some of those same practices to reach some of those same ends. So that's really dope. Thinking of the future as it relates to the Black community, what should we be thinking and doing as we go forward in our lives to reach a future that we actually exist in, actually exist in and thrive and survive in?
I really believe it's about our mind state, it's about hope. I mean, I hate to sound cliche, Julian, but I really do believe that people who are hopeless do not dream. And like I was saying before at the top of this interview, it's like, the freedom to dream and to imagine our possibilities and to know that those possibilities are endless is really how we survive this present state. That's how we move through it and overcome it and create a new reality of our own design, one that we dream up together. And I think that also for each individual, it's about our mindset. Again, it's like we also have to think about ourselves like, are we ready for the end? Like, if the end were to come tomorrow, but are we also ready for a new beginning? And how do we kind of lean into the fact that we could actually be in charge of that, right? We could actually be masters of our own destiny. Because a lot of us are feeling like, the world's just going to hell in a handbasket, and this is just this is just what it's going to be, you know what I mean? And we're just going to ride it out. But what if we actually could take control of the wheel and steer our future in the direction that we want to go? Like, we have to believe that that's possible. We can't give in to indifference. We have to lean into the imagination. I'm all about that.
Li Sumpter, I appreciate your time. I appreciate the work you do. Thank you for joining us on Black History Year.
Thank you for having me.
That was Li Sumpter, founder of Myth Media Studios. At Push Black, we agree with Marcus Garvey when he said, "A people without knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots." We believe telling empowering stories on Black life and history can build a more liberated Black future. Being here with us lets us know you probably feel like that's important too. You matter. Your choice to be here matters. It lets us know that you value this work. And you make Push Black happen with your contributions at blackhistoryyear.com. Most people do $5 or $10 a month, but really, everything makes a difference. Thank you for supporting the work. Black History Year is a production of Push Black, the nation's largest nonprofit Black media company. Our team includes Tariq Alani, Brooke Brown, Tasha Taylor, Somalia Ramin, Amber Davis, and Darren Wallace. Producing this episode, we have Sydney Smith and Lynn Webb for Push Black, and Ronald Young Jr., who also edits the show. Black History Year's executive producers are Lily Workna and me, Julian Walker. Peace.